от сети вовчу, словеси мятежно, плешма своим осенит тя, и под крыле его надеешься, оружием обыдет тя истина его, не убоишься от страха ночного, от стрелы летящие во дни, от вещи во тьме приходящие, от зрящей беса полуденного, подет от страны твоей тысяча, и тьма десну, и тебе к тебе же не.
This here is a bit the sound of a village that would have almost been wiped out in the war. Posad-Pokrowske in the south of Ukraine. This is a place that I have been accompanying for almost 3 years, that I visit again and again and also speak there with the inhabitants. A place in which almost every house has been destroyed in the war, and a place where the people nevertheless begin again to bury their lost ones, to want to send their children to school, to cultivate their gardens. Because of the Russian war of aggression, almost all the inhabitants had actually fled, but a third has meanwhile returned. The big question today is, and there Posad-Pokrowske stands actually a bit as a small particle for the bigger whole, will Posad-Pokrowske really become a living village again, or will it remain a rubble desert in which the people are fobbed off with big promises? In Crisis Mode, the podcast from crisis and war zones all over the world with journalist Jan Jessen.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from conflict zones with Jan Jessen.
Welcome to In Crisis Mode. I am Jan Jessen, Head of Politics and War and Crisis reporter for the FUNKE media group. Since the end of 2022, I have been traveling again and again to Posad-Pokrowske. That is a small village between Kherson and Mykolaiv in the south of Ukraine. This village was for several months after the beginning of the Russian war of aggression in February 2022, a frontline village. There was a hill beyond the village. Russian forces were stationed there. In the village itself, the Ukrainian forces. And they fired at each other there over several months. And this whole village was turned into a landscape of ruins, into a desert landscape. They had per day sometimes around 400 impacts. So every building was destroyed back then. And we came there back then when we drove to Kherson. Kherson, that is the only regional capital that the Russians at that time were able to occupy after their invasion. And we actually wanted to do a story about Kherson and the question, how is life there now after the liberation? And then we also drove through Posad-Pokrowske and saw that the village was completely destroyed, but we also saw people in this village. And then we went in and talked with those who had returned there. And that was super exciting. So they told us that of the once roughly 2,400 inhabitants, almost all had fled at the time, except for 30 who had stayed. Old people, disabled people who simply could not flee or did not want to flee. They slept in the cellars. They experienced these bombardments every day. Some of them also died. Altogether, the village had 17 dead. And when we then came back in November 22, there were still burned out tanks in the gardens. There were unexploded ordnance lying around. There was no electricity, no gas, no water. Then we also met someone, Oleg. You will hear more about him shortly. Oleg had been recommended to us by the other villagers because they said, this is a man you have to talk to. Because Oleg, during the fighting, although he had actually fled with his family and he has 2 sons, his wife, they had run away like all the others to Vinnytsia in the center of Ukraine. But he had forgotten documents and forgotten money in the village and therefore drove back. He saw there are still 30 people who stayed in the village. And for them, he then thought, I have to do something. And Oleg then, for months during the fighting, drove again and again into the village, brought food there, brought medicine there and other things. Relief organizations at that time did not dare to go into the village during the fighting. And then I thought, well, maybe one can work together with Oleg, and that's what we did. So we, as the FUNKE media group, collected a lot of money, 40,000 euros it was at that time. Also got money from other donors, and then with the aid transport in December 2022, we drove into the village. On board, there were generators, there were solar lamps, there were inverters, there were power banks and other things, so that the people at least had a bit of light in the winter. They also had chainsaws with them so that they could prepare firewood and such things. And that was actually a really great action. And of course, it was also wonderful to see when they then sent us the first pictures after they had installed the solar lamps, that this village now had light again. Oleg has meanwhile founded an initiative, More Deeds, Fewer Words. And indeed, he founded it because he is quite disappointed with the government, we will get to that in a moment, which had made such big promises, wanting to develop Posad-Pokrowske into a model village. The president was there, Zelensky, in this village in spring 2023. And, from the big promises, relatively little has come. That's why Ole founded this initiative with friends. And among other things, he lays water pipes, has roofed 140 houses, has distributed gas cylinders, especially to older people, so that they can cook in winter. And he has tried to create a perspective where others had long since given up.
I am from here. My fathers and my grandfathers are from here, and I will never betray my country.
That is Victor. He is 77 years old. He, like almost all the other villagers, had fled but returned in 2023. And meanwhile, around 750 people live in the village. There used to be more. There were about 830 in the summer of last year. But because the situation in the village is what it is, a few have run away again. And Victor, as I said, wants to stay. He says, my father died here, my grandfathers died here, and were buried here. By the way, you hear that very often in all the other villages in Ukraine that we visited, and where in some places people nevertheless stayed, even though they were fighting. And especially in eastern Ukraine, there is repeatedly the declaration, I want to stay here, especially from the older people. I want to stay because my parents, because my grandfathers, my grandparents were buried here. And I also want to be buried here. Victor, as I said, had fled, but returned and says simply, I just want to be here no matter how hard life is. And one problem is water. So there are still not enough water pipes that supply the village. That is why there is this central water point where I met Victor, where he then fetched water to improve his garden. What is clear is that he also comes from a generation that does not want to give up the homeland. Yes, as I said, water is a huge problem. Pipes have been laid, partly by private people like Oleg, partly by the government. But there is still not enough water. When you drive through the village, you see that as well. A lot has been done over all these years. I have now been a few times in Posad-Pokrowske. We have also reported again and again in this podcast about the village. We will put the episodes for you in the show notes. And yes, as I said, quite a bit has happened. You see construction activities in the village, but it is clearly behind what the people had actually wished for. And at this water distribution point in the village, I also met Irena. She is 72. She then arrived by bicycle and had with her 6 large plastic bottles, which she had actually hung on the handlebars, and she wanted to fill them, which she then did. And we then said, look, let us go to your place. If that's okay for you, show us where you live and how you live, because she had always also told us that her husband had died. She went back into the village with him because he absolutely wanted to return. And then after a year, he died of a stroke. Now she lives with her severely disabled son in such a small, tiny house, a prefabricated house that a relief organization built. Of those, there are several in this village. Those were, so to say, the first things that were done in the village were the covering of roofs, simply with simple tarpaulins. I also once wrote that this is the village of blue roofs, because everywhere there were these blue plastic tarpaulins on top, so that the building fabric underneath would not be completely destroyed. And there were these tiny houses. They are really such very small houses, also made of a kind of plastic, which can be built up quite quickly, and where still today some of these people live. And yes, I must also say that Posad-Pokrowske is also still quite close to the fighting. 2 days before we came there, a large ammunition depot exploded very close by. That was apparently a very big bang, a big explosion that happened there. And what the villagers also told us is that basically every night the drones can be heard that fly over the village. These Shahed drones that the Russians practically send into Ukraine every night, they make a sound like a motorcycle, like a high-revving motorcycle. You can hear that very, very clearly, and they also hear it every night. And in that respect, people like Irena also have quite a bit of worry that they may at some point have to leave the village again.
Yes, we are worried. We are afraid that we might have to flee again.
There is the fear, possibly, that now the war roller will roll over the village again. But on the other hand, there is also hope. And Irena then also showed me very proudly in her garden such a small greenhouse that was donated by the Red Cross, and their tomatoes and cucumbers are growing. And that is such a small piece of normality. And I really found it great to see this older lady who lives in this small, tiny house in which her son lies. Severely disabled, he needed diapers. One of the sons had also already died, fallen as a soldier. Another outside the country, or rather another was also in the armed forces, about whom she, of course, also worries. And yet she has not given up, although her husband has died. One of the sons has died. Another still in the field. She has not given up. Her old house that she had built up with her husband, that was completely destroyed in the fighting in 2022. Now the government has started to put up a shell there, or rather to build a new house, but this house is simply a shell. The outer walls have indeed been raised, but for months now simply nothing has happened. She found that a bit confusing and irritating. She, in this small tiny house, next to it an actually beautiful large house, if it should ever be finished. But the construction workers have left, and Irina told us that is because these construction workers are not being paid. On the other hand, villagers also told us that some of the workers are now being pulled to the front. That is, by the way, also something that really concerns Oleg, this young man of whom I told who founded this initiative. He repeatedly fears when he comes to checkpoints and is checked there that he might possibly be taken directly by the recruitment officers, sent to the training camp and then driven to the front. So also a huge problem when it comes to the topic of reconstruction. By the way, this does not only apply to Posad-Pokrowske, but of course also to the rest of Ukraine. A lot has now been destroyed, especially in the areas that have been liberated again. Of course, they try somehow to organize reconstruction so that people can return. But if there are simply not enough workers, then of course that is a problem. And for Irena, that means she now lives, first of all, in this small prefabricated house in the garden, while right next door a construction site lies fallow. And this fallow construction site is of course a symbol for many. A lot is started, little is finished, and as I said, that applies not only to Irena's house, but to many others that we passed by. Some even already had a roof, but then inside absolutely nothing is ready to move into. And the people find that a bit irritating, to put it mildly. Yes, and Oleg, as I said, that is the man whom we have been meeting again and again on site for a long time. Every time I visit there, I stop by, visit his family, chat with them, talk with them. And what I really like about them, he complains a lot, is grumpy about the government. But as I said, he does not want to give up. He goes around with his friends, helps older villagers, has completely roofed houses, not just with the plastic tarpaulin, but really roofed, has laid water pipes, has, which I find really great, at the end of his street there is a large open space, and they then created a park there, built a pavilion where you can sit and just have a beer or two. They planted trees in the bomb craters and built a playground there. And as I said, he is someone who really gets things done. And I think that's great. He is the face of the reconstruction in the village. And then I went with him, as I always do, through the village to see how Posad-Pokrowske has changed. And then we went to the memorial square that is in the center of the village. And on this memorial square there is also a monument that commemorates the dead of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, as they call it in the region. And back then, when Ukraine still belonged to the Soviet Union, many names were engraved on this monument of residents of Posad-Pokrowske who had fallen in that Second World War. And now there are also pictures of people who have fallen in the war against Ukraine. They display Ukrainian flags. And yes, Oleg stood in front of it, took off his baseball cap and then told me that of the 6 dead, he knew 5. One was his brother-in-law. He went to school with 4. A school, by the way, that no longer exists. It was completely destroyed during the fighting, just like the village kindergarten, just like the large cultural center. All of that is in ruins, which they have at least cleared now. So the ruins are no longer standing, but these are now open spaces where eventually something will be built. And in this context, Oleg then made very clear again that he is very afraid of being drafted. So he is definitely not a person who wants fighting or war. Of course, also with the warning in mind, what happened to his brother-in-law and what happened to his schoolmate. And on that occasion, he also spoke a bit about how he imagines his homeland again.
Якщо чесно, я навіть поки що не уявляю. Немає просто якоїсь чіткої картинки. Поки що не зрозуміло, що вони хочуть тут взагалі робити.
I can't even imagine it at the moment. There's just no clear picture. It's still not really clear what they actually want to do here. What we've seen so far is only the demolition of the damaged houses. But what it's supposed to look like in the end, we don't know. I can only say how I see my street and my neighborhood. There I see rebuilt houses, clean streets in front of every yard, well-kept front gardens. There are nice paths with paving stones, a blooming park with playgrounds. Maybe there's a summer cinema for children, even a swimming pool. Children would have the opportunity to spend their time well, just like the adults. And when it comes to the village, I hope that everything really gets rebuilt here. The school, the kindergarten, maybe even a new cultural center, maybe even a real cinema, maybe sports clubs and sports fields. Maybe there's also a large park in the middle of the village. By the way, we drove past the place where the school was demolished. They plan to create a park there, maybe with a lake. Whether that really happens, I don't know. We'll see.
Я маю надію, що тут будуть повністю відновлені всі всі потреби, да? Тобто школа, дитячий садок, можливо, новий якийсь будинок культури, можливо, це буде навіть якийсь в ньому кінотеатр більш такий конкретний, можливо, якісь будуть якісь спортивні клуби, майданчики. Можливо, тут буде якийсь великий парк в центрі села. Ми, до речі, проїжджали, да? Там, де школу вивезли. Вони ж планують там зробити парк. Типа здоровий сквер з озером. Це не знаю. Але побачимо.
The cinema, by the way, he actually built it, this small cinema he talked about. So the last time I was there, I was able to bring him a little money again, which I had collected in Germany. And this cinema is, of course, not a proper cinema, as one might imagine, but they bought a projector. We have a room with a large screen, and now there are cinema showings for the children of the village, who, of course, have a relatively boring life. There is almost nothing for the children in the village. School is done via distance learning, so online, and that for 3 years now, as I said. And the children, we also met them in the park. By the way, there are some of the children who then, in the ruins of the houses, play cops and robbers, make videos for YouTube, where gangsters play against good gangs, shoot each other, of course only for the YouTube videos, but that is what the children occupy themselves with. And so it was, of course, nice that Oleg now set up this makeshift cinema. But as I said, what you mainly see in Posad-Pokrowske are construction sites, houses that have been started but not finished. What has been completed is the central road of the village, which runs through the village. Posad-Pokrowske can be imagined mainly as a classic street village, right in the middle of the steppe, with a large main road running through it. That divides this village. The main road has meanwhile been repaired. That is also important because, of course, military transporters also use it. There are gas pipelines now, but not every house is connected. The villagers themselves mostly have to do that too, laying the connections to their houses. Water pipes have been laid, but as I already said, not for all houses. The large ruins have been cleared. That is the cultural center, the school and the kindergarten. And at some point, all of this is supposed to be rebuilt. But as I said, it all takes time. Everywhere in the village there are still somehow signs and pictures from some architectural offices that have thought about what Posad-Pokrowske should look like in the future. So, as I said, the government made big promises. It was said that Posad-Pokrowske would become a model village, ecologically valuable for the entire Ukraine, sustainable, and so on and so forth. But, as I said, so far not much has happened. What is functioning again is agriculture in the village. Most people in Posad-Pokrowske live from agriculture. At the beginning, that was a huge problem because all the fields, of course, were mined or contaminated with unexploded ordnance. And that also took time. 2 demining teams were sent in, also from the government, state demining teams, but they were not staffed in a way that allowed them to work quickly. This led to the farmers starting to pull these unexploded ordnances out of the ground themselves, which of course was extremely dangerous. If you just take a grenade, hook it and pull it out of the ground, it could easily go off. Unfortunately, 4 people died during one such demining operation in a canal. The issue of canals is also a problem for Posad-Pokrowske, for agriculture, because they actually had a sophisticated irrigation system dating back to Soviet times. So canals that stretched into the village, open canals. These open canals were used during these military actions by the tanks and armored personnel carriers. They drove into them to get some cover. And in the process, these canals were damaged, so much of the water that actually flows through them now seeps into the ground, which already causes major problems for agriculture. But as I said, agriculture is now working reasonably well again. On my last visit, I was also given a large watermelon as a gift. The rainy region is known for growing watermelons. I found that quite nice as a present. And it also gave me a sign that somehow things in Posad-Pokrowske are progressing. And even though many of the villagers, of course, see the whole thing critically, the problem is always when you give people hope, as the government did, as the president did when he was in Posad-Pokrowske, and then little or nothing happens. That is, of course, the most fatal thing that can happen. That makes people angry and upset, or at least depressed. But not everyone is like that. Victor, the very elderly man I mentioned earlier, whom I asked about the many construction sites, reacted surprisingly calmly.
I wouldn't criticize now. They're doing it normally.
Someone sounds completely different, whom I have also known in the village for a very, very long time. His name is also Victor, and Victor is the priest of the village. And this priest, he is such an old Orthodox priest, a huge bushy beard, and we occasionally made a few jokes about him because I had once given him 5,000 euros for the renovation of his church when he was there in December 2022. It's a very, very small village church, blue, with a very small tower. We have these onion domes in Ukraine, just like in Russia, and they are usually gilded, but this onion dome is not even gilded because they simply couldn't afford it. Most people in Posad-Pokrowske don't even go to church, and they didn't go before either. Anyway, I thought back then, in December 2022, that this could also be a positive sign for the reconstruction if the church were renovated. It wasn't completely destroyed, but had cracks in the masonry. That's why I gave Victor 5,000 euros. And then Victor was gone at some point with his wife. And so our team, whenever we went there, would go looking for Victor. And Nikolai, our driver, was somehow quite angry with Victor and wanted to chase him the whole time or something, I don't know. In the meantime, Victor is back, and then we actually went to the church. And as it turned out, there was a funeral that day. And Victor also briefly told us about rumors circulating in the village.
They are starting to build houses. They are setting up the construction kits. But someone said that the construction company from Kyiv probably stole money.
That is also something that constantly circulates as a rumor through Posad-Pokrowske, not just through Posad-Pokrowske, but through many other towns in Ukraine, this issue of corruption. Ukraine used to be the country in Europe most infected by corruption. That has improved significantly, but somehow the perception still remains that basically if something goes wrong somewhere, someone has filled their pockets as a conviction. Whether that is the case in Posad-Pokrowske, I don't know, I can't say. Anyway, when we were at the cemetery, which is also a very old cemetery where people are now being buried again, a coffin was taken out of an old red transporter. Oleg and his people also did that. The transporter was actually one they used to carry materials around. And then they were asked by relatives of the deceased who were being buried whether they could organize a coffin from a village nearby towards Kherson. Because in this coffin carpentry in that village, there were particularly cheap coffins. The problem was that this village was already under Russian fire control. That means the driver who went with the transporter to get a coffin came under fire himself and later told us, as we were sitting on the edge watching how this elderly lady was laid out, that it had been a very adrenaline-filled journey. And he was also quite glad that he somehow returned alive with the coffin. I found that really interesting about him. Anyway, we then also watched this burial.
Many people want to be buried here, but many have already been buried in Mykolaiv or Vinnytsia, and some of them even bought houses there. Yet in the end, they still want to come back here, back to their village.
That is what the pastor, what Victor just said, is very important for the people. So many, especially the older people, for them it is immensely important to be buried at home, to be buried in their homeland, to be buried where their parents have already been buried, where their grandparents have already been buried, where their friends and acquaintances have been buried. And that is exactly the reason why they do not leave this place. Posad-Pokrowske, even though the situation 3 years or almost 3 years after the liberation is still somewhat difficult. What I always find exciting and remarkable about these visits is that the people just keep going. Despite this mystical situation, even though they hear the sounds of war every night, drones and occasionally explosions, in Kherson, the situation in the big city is also becoming more problematic day by day. The front may not advance quickly, but little by little, and yet they remain in this village. They still believe that Posad-Pokrowske has a future. The farmers still work in the fields. And I find that very, very exciting. And that is why I also believe it is very important to continue supporting this village. We will do that too. I have clearly promised that we will keep coming back again and again. We have already stayed in the village a few times. Thank you very much. It is very rustic, but then there are also very nice evenings when you sit together, especially in the summer outside in Oleg's garden. The whiskey is put on the table, homemade schnapps. There is very rustic food. These are always very nice evenings where you chat about the soakiness, and yes, simply very nice. And we will definitely continue to support this village. For me, the village is also a kind of symbol for how things will go with Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine as a whole faces enormous challenges. The government is trying to repair war damage, but it first focuses on what is important for the war, like road construction or the repair of rail systems and similar things, or the repair of critical infrastructure. When the Russians have once again blown up substations or destroyed power grids or shelled power plants, of course, those are the things that are prioritized first. And that villages like Posad-Pokrowske then fall a bit behind. That affects the mood of the population. And as I said, on the other hand, it is also the great challenge for the time after the war. So if there is finally, hopefully soon, peace in Ukraine, the country faces enormous challenges regarding reconstruction. We are now talking about war damage amounting to at least the equivalent of 700 billion euros. Money has to be organized for that. It has to be brought into the country. It has to actually be delivered into the country. That is not an easy task in terms of corruption. These are immense challenges that this country faces. But on the other hand, I also see in the people who live in Posad-Pokrowske this will to persevere, this will to keep going, and the will to rebuild their homeland. And that is something I always find, as I said, remarkable when I have been in the village. This was in crisis mode. This episode was produced by Alexander Baumeister. He is also a journalist at the FUNKE Media Group radio station. If you like the podcast, follow us, rate us, write to us if you like. Every 2 weeks on Wednesday there is a new episode. And from time to time, when world events require it, there are also special episodes. Thank you for being with us today. Take care. See you soon. Ciao, ciao.
In Crisis Mode, the podcast from Conflict Zones with Jan Jessen.